celebration in Syria that have swept over the media are taken from one of the most historical events of 2024. We have seen everything from full-fledged wars to bombings, and now we are witnessing the overthrowing of an oppressive government. In 9 days, what was once a dynasty that had ruled for half a century came toppling down, and everything it stood for became nothing. After a lengthy civil war, the Assad regime has fallen, and the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad has fled the capital and found refuge in the bosom of his fellow dictator ally, Putin. The rebel group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has led a strong coalition against the Assad regime and declared that they have captured Damascus and ended Assad's rule. For many of you who have been struggling to keep up with all the global news, we are going to break down the 9-day assault for you and give some insight into the future of Syria. Keeping up with geopolitics is a lot of work, but we push tirelessly to make sure that you are clued up on everything happening. Unfortunately, this is not what the algorithm wants, and sometimes our videos get downvoted. To help us, please like our videos and share them with your friends and family. Right, let's get into today's video. So let us start with a timeline of how everything went down. The road to destruction started on November 27, when the rebel forces launched their first attack in western Aleppo, which is in northern Syria, where at least 37 people were killed, and when the rebels seized 13 villages. This attack was significant because the rebels managed to seize Base 46, which is the largest Syrian regime army base in western Aleppo. The entire thing came as a bit of a shock, but the government did not think much of it, which, as we will see soon, was a very big mistake. 3 days later, on November 30, the rebels took control of Aleppo city and began to make their somewhat cryptic intentions a lot clearer. They defaced posters of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and took control of Aleppo, which is the second largest city in Syria. This move was massive and made it abundantly clear that the rebels would soon be moving on to the capital, Damascus. Only then, 3 days too late, did the government gear into action and start preparing for a counter-offensive. On December 5, the rebels moved on with their offensive and took over the city of Hama. If the government had not already realized, it was in grave danger. It figured it out on this day because this city is strategically located and provides direct supply lines between Damascus and Aleppo. Embarrassingly, the Assad regime had to move out of the region and the military withdrew, giving the rebels more room. The next day, the rebels took over Daraya, which was symbolically the birthplace of the 2011 uprising against the Assad regime. From here, they continued on toward Damascus with little to no pushback from the regime. After Daraa, the rebels moved on to Homs, making their city takeover number a lucky 3. It did not take long to take control of Homs, and some residents joined the rebels in celebrating the successful takeover of key cities in Syria. The final blow and the big win came on December 8th when the rebel group took over Damascus. The leader of Syria's Islamist Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, marked the moment by speaking at the Umayyad Mosque after taking control of the capital, stating that the capital of Damascus had been liberated with very little resistance from regime forces. In the heat of all the celebrations, Russian state media confirmed that the Syrian leader had fled to Moscow, further cementing the fall of the Assad regime. Now, we need to understand that the pivotal moment in all of this was the Damascus fall. The rebels' agenda from the beginning was to get to the capital, and that is why they put so much effort into the attack on Damascus. There are a lot of reasons for this, but one of the obvious ones is based on what the capital city represents. It is the same reason that Putin was gunning for Kiev and Ukraine was targeting Moscow. If you can get control of the capital city, you basically have control of the country. The second aspect of the attack is symbolic because Damascus is the political and administrative arm of Syria. The central government reigns from here, and when the rebels took Damascus, they defeated the central government. Damascus is also a special city because of its cultural heritage, and it is one of the oldest inhabited cities in the entire world. It is also a sacred city in Islamic history and played a significant role in the spread of Islam. This victory against the Assad regime was also very psychological, and it gave the citizens the courage to actually stand up against the oppressive regime. The city is also a central hub for transportation because of its geographical location, which is strategically near Lebanon and Jordan, which makes it a great gem for trade and commerce. This means whoever has control of Damascus holds the fate of the country economically and logistically. The city is home to many industrial plants and manufacturing hubs, as well as the financial hub housing the central bank of Syria and many commercial banks too. This has made the rebel group's victory so much sweeter and also made it very clear that the Assad regime is done. But let's back up a bit and talk about the beginning of the end for the Assad regime for a little bit. You have to be doing something really wrong as a government to create such strong and radical opposition, right? Correct. Nobody just wakes up with enemies plucked from the air. This all started with Hafez al-Assad, who founded this all in 1970 and set up the Assad regime. He was a Syrian military officer with a lot of ambition and drive who decided to initiate a coup against the ruling Ba'ath Party. Although the Assad regime's downfall happened under his son's leadership, from the moment he stepped into power, he was already running the operation into the ground. The first issue with Hafez as a leader was the fact that he was not representative of the wider demographic of Syria. He was part of the Alawite minority, which is a sect of Shia Islam that mixes a bit of Christianity, Gnosticism, and other traditions. Despite the fact that he was part of the minority, Hafez managed to consolidate power with the military by promoting his fellow religious members into key political positions. Does this strategy sound familiar? Well, it is basically the dictator's blueprint at this point. This helped him to create a loyal base and strengthened his hold of power in Syria. Again, like every other classic dictator, Hafez's rule was built on glamorizing his public image. He was portrayed as a strong and powerful leader and the father of modern Syria. He managed to maintain power by control through numerous security and intelligence networks and the secret police who cracked down on any opposition. The most powerful tool of control was the Mukhabarat, which is an intelligence security force that Hafez uses to suppress opposition and maintain control. There was also a ban on other political parties, and political activists and intellectuals were arrested and often executed. Assad's Ba'ath Party was the one and only legal party in Syria and reigned the country like it was a personal business. The next area of control was the media, and the Syrian media was basically the government's mouthpiece. News outlets and media channels were used to push positive messaging about the government, and there were no dissenting voices. Human rights abuses were also rampant during the time, and beatings and electric shocks were often administered against political prisoners. At the end of the day, Hafez's reign was about maintaining a strong military and having a tight grip on power. He worked hard to nationalize industries and reform land, but as is often the case, corruption took over most of the time, and that meant that the state was run down. In 2000, after his death, his son Bashar al-Assad took over, and many people waited with bated breath, hoping that this would come with much-needed change. The transition was actually quite smooth, and Bashar earned about 92.9% of the vote in his election. He was young and fresh and had studied medicine, specializing in ophthalmology. This gave the people some hope that this would mean that there would be reforms in favor of the people. In the early years, he played along to the people's tune for a bit, but he soon showed his true colors. He allowed people to speak up, and it was the first time civil societies had an opportunity to contribute to the government. Unfortunately, he could not find a balance, so he panicked and decided to follow in his father's footsteps. Bashar became a chip off the old block and was an authoritarian in the same way his father was. The Syrian people remained silent for a decade until the 2011 uprising, when the cracks started to show. So this is where everything that is happening today started. Around this time, Tunisia and Egypt were experiencing successful uprisings where they had managed to take out their authoritarian rulers, and this gave Syrians a bit of hope that this could also happen for them. What really was the lighting match was an incident in March 2011 when a group of children were arrested and tortured by the authorities for writing anti-regime graffiti in Daraya. This began the Bashar hate train, and everyone began to call out for his downfall. This would have been the perfect opportunity for the Assad regime to do damage control, but it decided to respond with brutal force to suppress demonstrations. This made the resistance stronger, and more Syrians joined the protests, demanding more freedom, democracy, and an end to authoritarian rule. From here, it became a cycle: uprising, then violence to silence the people, and further uprising. The Assad regime chose to be deaf to people's demands, and that is what toppled the regime. As a people, you can only be beaten down for so long before you start retaliating. In 2012, there was a battle for Aleppo when rebel forces were brave enough to attack. At this point, the rebel groups had grown into many factions, with parts of the Syrian army and other jihadist groups joining in. Aleppo was divided into two, and the government and the rebels held their own parts of the city. The Assad regime decided to go scorched earth on the matter and used airstrikes to take out the rebels and destroyed all the opposition using responded fighter jets and attack helicopters. At this point, there was no thought about the citizens or how this would affect the country. This ended the battle in Aleppo quickly, but things then turned to the city of Homs. This city was a soft spot for the rebels because it was known as the capital of the revolution, but it suffered greatly because of this title. The regime held nothing back, and the fight took many lives and destroyed entire neighborhoods in days. Things were so bad, there was an entire refugee crisis in the 2010s, with many Syrians fleeing to Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. The conditions in these camps were heartbreaking, and the overcrowding led to unsanitary conditions, which took out more Syrians. About 5 million Syrians had to endure these scary conditions, and the even scarier part was the number of deaths during this civil war, with a staggering 400,000 people reported to have died because of how bad things were getting. The international community also stepped in and tried to bring about a ceasefire. In 2016, the Assad regime had managed to keep things under wraps, but this was because it had outside help, of course. The Russian government was definitely a culprit, and it was a big part of the reason why Syria was able to stabilize its power, because the Kremlin stepped in and set up bases in Syria while also providing its troops. From 2016 till now, it may have seemed like the regime had won, but the opposition has only been biding its time until now. The offensive that the rebels carried out was a clean sweep, and we need to talk about why this was the perfect time for them to secure victory. This was not a luck situation, and so many things fell into place at once. We need to realize that the Assad regime was as powerful as it was because of the alliances it had, and the rebels chose to strike when they knew that the government would be weak. Let's take Russia, for example. The Syrian Arab army has always received advanced military equipment, including tanks, artillery, and air defense systems from Russia. Russia has also poured billions of dollars into Syria between 2015 and 2024, and its investments in oil and gas through Russia's oil company, Rosneft, allowed the Syrian government to develop several oil and gas fields in the country. Another ally is Iran, and its military support has been very noteworthy. Like Moscow, Iran has deployed troops from its Revolutionary Guard to fight in the Syrian army, and even had its military commanders provide tactical advice to the Syrian Arab army. At some point, when things were really bad, Iran provided Syria with oil shipments that helped when the country had fuel shortages. According to the Atlantic Council, Iran's credit line to Syria has been ongoing, and Iran has also poured billions of dollars in through loans, humanitarian aid, and military support. Iran has also joined a regional network that includes Russia, which basically fights for Syria on the international front like bodyguards. All of this has been done under the disguise of providing diplomatic solutions for peace. The two parties may pretend like they are helping an ally out, but they both have their own personal agendas. Russia is doing this to maintain its influence in the Middle East and secure its military presence in Syria, while Iran supports the Assad regime to strengthen its regional influence and pocket an ally at the same time. The rebels chose this time because the Assad regime's bodyguards have their hands full right now. Iran has to deal with Israel and Hezbollah, and Russia has been distracted by Ukraine for almost 3 years now. This means that they do not have the financial or diplomatic capacity to help their ally right now. Russia specifically is in a tight spot because it is losing the war at such a fast rate, it is embarrassing. Because of this, every single coin in its possession is being pushed to its own conflict with Ukraine. Iran is also in hot soup because of sanctions, so it has had to turn off the faucet in Syria to stay afloat. This has been really good for the rebels because one of the things that had really crippled them was the infamous Russian airstrikes. Without the big boys next to it, the Assad regime had to fight on its own and reveal how disturbingly weak the government was alone. The rebels themselves are a force to be reckoned with because they have gone through a lot and built resilience. Remember, these groups have been going at it for over a decade now, and somehow they are still kicking. One thing that was permanently stamped in their minds is the chemical warfare that the Syrian government employed in 2013, and they have been waiting for their moment of retribution since then. The chemical attacks were very controversial, and experts from the United States, the United Kingdom, and France confirmed that the Assad regime had used chemical weapons, including sarin, and killed some 100 to 150 people. The United States and France had seen witness accounts of the physiological symptoms, which were consistent with exposure to chemical weapons. Sarin is a highly toxic poison that is known to cause muscle paralysis, breathing problems, and finally, death. There was widespread international condemnation after this, and the Assad regime cemented itself as a nuisance from then on. The rebels never forgot how they were treated in this situation, and their bitterness fueled the movement and allowed them to get enough power to attack now. Vengeance is a very strong drug, and a lot of citizens have been waiting for the downfall of the Assad regime for years. These little incidents have been affecting the regime's grip on power, as they have continued to become more and more unpopular. All of the fighting between the rebels and the government has also not helped the citizens who have lost homes, been displaced, lost access to water and medical care, and other basic necessities. The proverb, "When the elephants fight, the grass suffers," comes to mind when you think of the fact that a lot of the attacks have targeted important facilities like schools and hospitals too. You can only get away with so much before people begin to fight back. The Syrian population has faced a lot of trauma because of the violence and instability, and all of these factors fueled the support for the rebel groups. The loss of popular support was so bad for the Syrian government that it even began to lose some of its own troops. This is what led to the very little resistance against the rebels and aided the regime's downfall. Okay, so before we talk about how Syria's future is looking, let us talk about the winners in the game for a second. As we said earlier, taking down the regime was a team effort from a lot of different bodies. The first body, and probably the largest voice, is the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which we will call HTS from this point on. It started out as the official al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria under the name Nusra Front and used to stage attacks in Damascus against Assad. Its leader's name was Ahmed al-Shara, whose battle name was Abu Muhammad al-Golani, and he decided to form the al-Qaeda organization and undergo a rebrand. The problem was that aligning with groups like al-Qaeda was bad for the press, and Ahmed was looking to change that. Despite these efforts, the group is still considered a terrorist organization by most countries, and that is why the group decided to start working with other groups to sanitize its image. Another group that has been big support has been the Syrian National Army. This specific group is backed heavily by Turkey, and it is made up of troops who were sent to Syria in 2016. These troops formed some of the groups into the Syrian National Army and decided to join forces with the HTS to fight the Assad regime. Closely linked to this group is another strong group that is now called the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF. It began as the Kurdish-led People's Protection Units, YPG, which took control of large areas of northeast Syria in 2012 and later joined other groups to form the SDF alliance of Kurdish and Arab militias, backed by the US and its allies. This part of the coalition controls most of the quarter of Syria that lies east of the Euphrates, including the former Islamic State capital of Raqqa and some of the country's biggest oil fields. When it was necessary, this group of people was willing to come together to fight for Syria, but now that the common enemy is out of the picture, what is the way forward? The HTS is the largest and most organized group of these groups, and it has every intention of establishing a government based on Islamic principles. It is unclear whether they will be radical, considering that they have put a lot of work into cleaning their public image. The problem is that, on the other hand, you have groups like the National Front for Liberation, which is an umbrella group of various Syrian opposition groups. Their vision for Syria is a democratic government that respects human rights and ensures the rule of law. Will these different visions be easy to unify? Probably not. You also have smaller groups like Ahrar al-Sham, with the vision of establishing an Islamic State government run by Sharia law. On top of all these other groups, you also have J-al-A, which is a rebel group that envisions the protection of the interests of all Syrians, and the Jaish al-Azza group, who also want an Islamic State governed by Sharia law. Each of these groups has contributed in some way to the downfall of the Assad regime, but the truth is that some groups' visions will have to die. Will any of the groups be willing to back down? That is a really scary question. One thing that is certain is that there is going to be more fighting. Removing Assad was the first step, but now these factions are going to have to go head-to-head to stay on top. While this has been happening, the international community has been watching, not really sure where to place itself. One thing that everyone has agreed on is that they want things to be handled peacefully, because the globe has seen enough war for the year. Russia, which has not in any way hidden its support for Syria, has given the Syrian leader political asylum and urged its citizens to leave Syria. In an exclusive interview, Putin's deputy foreign minister Sergei Ryabkov confirmed that Assad is in the country, saying he is secured, and it shows that Russia acts as required in such an extraordinary situation. I have no idea what is going on with him right now, and it would be very wrong for me to elaborate on what happened and how it was resolved. Ryabkov also made it clear that Russia would continue to support the Syrian leader, even though his regime has been accused of everything from using chemical weapons and barrel bombs to murder and systematic torture. When asked if they would hand over Assad to the International Criminal Court, Ryabkov stated that Russia is not a party to the convention that established the ICC. The recent president-elect, Donald Trump, decided to also chime in on the situation and stated that this was surprisingly a situation that the US would stay out of. His message on social media was very clear. This is not our fight. The current National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has also chimed in and made it clear that the United States is not going to militarily interfere in the middle of a Syrian civil war. Trump has also made it clear that he does not believe that Assad should stay in power, but the US will take an observatory role and cautiously watch how everything plays out. This new norm is about to create a very sticky situation for the international community. On the one hand, you have powers like Iran and Russia that were backing Assad, and then the US and Turkey that were playing a backseat role in fighting against the government. Each of the different factions also had their own external allies, and now they are going to be caught up in the messy web of bringing it all together. While there will definitely be a season of struggle coming for Syria, new beginnings are on the horizon. Removing the Assad government and all of this territorial rule has created a space for Syria to become a place for democracy and freedom. If these different factions stay true to the promises that they made as they fought the Assad regime, there is a lot to look forward to. At the same time, it is important to remain cautious, and we will be watching everything as it unfolds and bringing you all the updates as they happen.